it was a huge learning period for us. Like, how do we connect with like different groups on campuses, right? And how do we make ourselves accessible to the wider campus body? It wasn't just about doing actions, but it was also how do we connect with other organizations as well, build coalitions and those sort of things. And I think it was a really unique, that was also another unique challenge we were having at that time period.
So there's two very important theories that it's not just theories, they're not just theoretical knowledge, but praxis, the revolutionary praxis, taking theory and applying it to the real world. And those are two things: converging systems of oppression and intersectionality. The
Yeah.
reality is all the noble struggles of this world, whether they are in defense of women against misogynist violence, whether they are in defense of working class families against capitalism and classism, and so on and so forth, whether it is against the evil Indian occupation of Kashmir, or the Burmese junta that is, genociding Rohingya brothers and sisters, or China's attempts to oppress people in East Turkestan or Sudan, and I could keep going. But the idea
Yeah.
is all our struggles are interlinked. So it's not coincidental, for example, that Israel and the United States were the means by which apartheid South Africa had nuclear weapons to deter other African nations from intervening in this white supremacist project. There's so many natural, organic connections between communities of color that are suffering, whether they're African American, Latinx, East Asian, Pacific Islander, indigenous, that we have these that we don't want a transactional relationship. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. No, an attack against Black students is an attack on us. An attack against
Yeah.
indigenous communities is an attack on us, and vice versa. We have to have each other's back, and this is inshallah, the movement that will lead us to success and liberation worldwide. And there's so many ahadith, and even from our Islamic tradition, that says, the Muslim, the ummah is as if it's one body, that if you hurt one part of that body, the entire body experiences the sensation. And that if you see something unjust, that you have a moral obligation to correct it with your hands, and
Yeah.
to speak out against it. And if you can't do that, hate it in your heart. But that is the weakest expression of faith. So
Yeah,
that's kind of
absolutely.
my 2 cents on that.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I remember you speaking exactly like this back in the day. Like, it's a little bit more polished now, but you were trying to articulate it in this way back then. And we would have these literal discussions about, these sort of strategies.
Sorry, I do want to mention one beautiful connection that I love talking about. And it was the famed dissident intellectual, Pakistani dissident intellectual and intellect, Iqbal Ahmed, who put Edward Said on game, bro. Edward Said, back in the day, was just an intellectual who dug
Yeah.
European literature. It was Iqbal Ahmed that radicalized him and turned him into the anti-colonial titan that we know
Yeah,
today. So subhanAllah, beautiful intersection.
absolutely. From the So around that time, did you notice any shift in how freely you could speak or organize on campus, especially around Palestine, Islam, and U.S. foreign policy? And was the space of dissent beginning to narrow before the future crackdown would take place or the arrest would take place?
Absolutely. So it's very interesting. What I noticed, and what I would even say about the present moment, and we'll probably touch on this later, but what I do want to mention is that when societies become more repressive of freedom of speech in regards to specific movements, that means that those movements are winning. That means that we are on the brink of success and victory at the expense of whatever evil administration or system is denying us the right to freedom of expression.
Yeah.
And I saw that basically over decades, as many resistance movements and liberation movements do, they gain momentum, they grow stronger, they gain more of a presence
Yeah.
of power, and they're recognized by power. With these, I would say that, attempts to silence us are recognitions of how much of a threat we are to the status quo and how effective our protest is. And so are you talking specifically Irvine 11, or are we talking of just general?
I'm talking about the universities in Southern California at the time and UC Riverside, where you were primarily based, and then going into other campuses. Uh, what was there? You noticing anything change on the ground at that time period?
Yes. I mean, we always noticed a heavy-handed approach. We sort of always anticipated some sort of racist act of discrimination on behalf of the university, and that we noticed that there was this interesting discourse. I say this, I connect Zionism and white supremacy together, and I see them as both supremacist ideologies. And they sort of adopted this like contemporary language of victimhood. They've appropriated the language of resistance. So if you
Mhm.
challenge apartheid or white supremacy or racism, you're the
Mhm.
real racist because you're denying the racist the ability to be racist. And
Yeah.
somehow you're the bad guy because of that. So there's like weird Orwellian doublespeak and mental gymnastics that are being done. And so we noticed that there was this language by the university that was done to delegitimize anything that we did in defense of human rights. That somehow human rights were invalid and the feelings of racists were more valid and more important.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that was something that sort of grew and escalated from the university. And that, there's always been what people describe as a Palestinian exception to freedom of speech. But I would say there's a general trend of suppression for the movements of people of color and marginalized communities.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, Palestine was given a special exception, and we grew up in a weird time of like, I don't even call it digital or media violence. Jack Shaheen, Real Bad Arabs author and filmmaker, basically said that 95% of depictions of Muslims and Arabs, particularly Palestinians, were overwhelmingly negative and dehumanizing.
Yeah.
We were still the bad guys in other films, but at least we were treated as human beings. So yeah, man, it was escalating time of narrowing the realm of freedom of speech in defense
Mhm.
of Israeli apartheid and U.S. complicity for Israeli apartheid and genocide and ethnic cleansing.
So now let's transition into Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. It was a major turning point for our activism on campus. And internally, I remember so many of our close Palestinian friends, were impacted by that moment. Can you give a little bit of a context about that and how that changed our approach to activism?
Oh, yes. So, what I would describe as Israel's general policy was just a general policy of wiping out the indigenous Palestinian inhabitants. And it was doing so in careful, from our perspective, maybe more subtle and cancerous genocide, slowly corroding Palestinian society and over a period of time, wiping us all out in a slow, cancerous death that
Mhm.
slowly ate at us. And then we saw this belligerence, this escalation of violence on behalf of Israel with the punishing. I mean, it's funny how it correlates to limiting democracy and populism in the Middle East or Swana region, Southwest Asia, North Africa, and limitations on freedom of speech here. That in 2006, 2007, the Carter Foundation basically made sure that there were free elections in Palestine, and Palestinian people were overwhelmingly in favor of Hamas. They democratically elected into power. And I want to say that there's even this political mythology, this like Hamas has become a racial boogeyman, but in reality, who are Israel and the United States, the major proponents of political violence in the world, to call this a terrorist organization? Yeah. So, anyways, basically, as punishment for electing a government that would not capitulate towards Israeli settler colonialism, they started a genocidal and starvation and limiting food supplies as a tactic in 2007, 2006, 2007, and then as I mentioned, as part of this escalation, Israel would begin bombing one of the most densely populated civilian areas in the world, essentially a giant concentration camp, killing I think roughly 1,400 people. Two of whom were my relatives, and I just felt so heartbroken. And I think what was more perverse, or equally perverse, was our society's response to that, the university's response to that. How UCI in just months, like the bodies of our martyrs weren't even cold yet, and
Yeah.
UCI wants to extend an invitation to an Israeli, an ambassador of this apartheid and evil genocidal machine. It'd be one thing, and it would have been insulting enough to invite us to a debate where we had to negotiate our humanity with a proponent of apartheid, racism, and ethnic cleansing. But they
Mhm.
didn't even, it wasn't even at that level of indignity. The indignity was much higher in that they wanted to celebrate and laud this person as, this ambassador of genocide and ethnic cleansing as someone that, we can put on a pedestal and give him a standing ovation for crimes against humanity.
Remember, before the lead up to the Irvine thing, there were like a series of die-ins, a series of events held on campus to create awareness and like this critical mass around that. And I think the die-in was so powerful because it gave us time to like humanize. A lot of our events were built around like humanizing the death of Palestinians, right? And ensuring that their memory didn't go wasted. You know what I mean? Like, it was about ensuring that we could grieve and we could do those sort of things in that manner. As you were mentioning, the dehumanizing tendency towards Palestinian life, right? And I think like a lot of our actions were built around humanizing and ensuring that there wasn't an erasure of Palestinian death, right?
Yeah, we had a lot of creative ways of protesting that. Like, I want to paint a picture. I want people to visualize some of the cool things that we did. Some of the things that we did, I hope, will be historically documented, and I think that they will be. It's just that
Yeah.
at the time that they were happening, they were seen as, whatever, marginal or insignificant. But we have to understand that Western civilization in many ways is an infrastructure of violence. And
Yeah.
in the background, what's supposed to be normalized is that the United States will routinely just bomb countries in the global south. Some South American presidency will be toppled, or in the background of Western civilization, the background of us going to movies and going to fast food drive-throughs or whatever, there's just going to be daily and routine reports of like mass killings in some desert Muslim majority society. And so this society in a very evil way tries to normalize the mass slaughter of our people and tries to say that our people's lives are insignificant, whether it's Palestinian or, again, general trends of animosity and contempt towards non-white life.
Uh-huh.
Um, and we did a lot of things. Like, I remember one time we had a dramatization of a checkpoint, such a humiliating experience. So,
Yeah.
Palestinians, our freedom of movement is restricted. And I remember, like, I got to be
Just getting into the lead up towards the February 8th, 2010 US Irvine hosting Israeli ambassador Michael Oren. What led you guys to the decision that you had to organize for this? And what was the sort of discussion that took place, or like what was the plan going into that? Like, because I do feel like it was a huge pivotal moment in organizing on campuses at that time period.
I credit a lot of the original like planning and organizing to UCI MSU. Actually, so I want to be clear, members of UCI MSU. So
Yeah.
members of UCI MSU were some of the lead organizers for that. We were just invited to participate. And it was funny
Yeah.
because I was kind of told the day of. So I've been to many protests at UCI before, showing solidarity and support, I guess, the leadership of other movements and other campuses. So we went out to support, and we would love it, man. It was a beautiful experience, being part of that community and defending so many beautiful, noble causes. Halfway, I remember on the 91 West, halfway, where we're passing that hill on Yorba Linda, that little mountain, Lahada turns back to me and says, like, hey, just to let you know, in anticipation of racist discrimination. He said, like, just so you know, we might get arrested. And so, but my response was, hell yeah, I'm down. Because,
Yeah.
yeah, the martyrdom of my relatives made me feel that although it was scary to be in a situation like that, that my sense of obligation and duty superseded my fear. I felt like if my family are dying, at the very least I can do is jeopardize a small amount of my personal safety to
Yeah.
speak truth to power.
Yeah. No, that's interesting that that actually came up in the discussion prior. I would, because I don't think people got arrested like that often, right?
They didn't, especially if they had a lot paler skin than ours. Especially if
Yeah.
they're more susceptible to sunburns. So basically, what
So
we
so
noticed.
there was that like sort of sense of the moment, right? Like going into that protest or action.
We just knew the general trend of racist discrimination that we faced, that the issue of Palestine faced, and we also understood that the protest that we were planning was very tame and well within the norm of student protest. That
Yeah.
actually our white counterparts and right wing counterparts, Zionist counterparts, would do much worse and get away
Yeah.
with. But we realized that there was a small chance that, like, hey, it's probably not going to happen, but we may face a level of selective enforcement and discrimination. And boy, were we right.
So can you get into that a little bit more? Like when you get to Irvine, what is takes place? How does the event begin? And like where were you guys positioned? And what was the scene that takes place
I
in that
remember,
lecture?
I remember that we got there and I was very nervous, and and I was given um, a piece of international law that Israel had violated to basically, and let me just put it like this: it's often framing is a huge issue we were denied an opportunity to express our opposition. We were denied a voice. Palestinian students were silenced on campus. And this event was an act of racial contempt against brown students and Palestinian students on campus. If we're going to celebrate the people and the or institutions that have genocided your cousins and your relatives, we're saying that your life is forfeit. Your life is not valuable to this institution. And so we basically, since we had been denied an opportunity to voice our dissent or intellectually challenge the indefensible, settler colonialism, mass murder, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Since we were denied that opportunity, we created a speaking opportunity for ourselves. We added to the discussion and interjected our voices. So basically, we arrive on campus. I'm very nervous. I generally get scared of public speaking. I love it. It always gets me butterflies. We met up with the MSU. Individuals from the MSU that we had met through MSU, but not the MSU itself. These people acted as individuals, and not everyone was in agreement. So anyways, I want to say we had about like 50 to 100 students that were there, and we start heading over to this auditorium where we are the minority compared to maybe like 300 or 400 other right-wing, conservative, racist, and pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, pro-genocide, folks that are seated there. And it was tense. The tension was palpable. It was like humidity, you could feel it. And especially for those of us who were visibly Muslim, like specifically our sisters in hijab, people kind of knew like, uh-oh, here comes trouble. And of course, the crowd was already hostile and racist towards us. So it's very tense. And the tension throughout the duration of the event kept escalating. So we're seated, and again, there's this like unspoken hostility, this unspoken tension that exists, and between the cheerleaders for genocide and those of us who have a sense of consciousness and value for Palestinian human life. And then Michael Oren, this corny guy, man, just like comes up on stage, says like these rehearsed jokes that are super lame. The whole speech was corny, bro. And then
so you guys actually listened to the whole speech?
No. We again, since we had been denied an opportunity to have our voices heard, we interjected what I believe was a much more intellectually stimulating part of the conversation. So I want to say maybe 10 or 15 minutes in, I forget exactly, but Osama Shabaik says, in anticipation of this sort of like this reverse accusation that somehow we affected his freedom of speech, which was absolutely ridiculous. Violations of freedom of speech don't happen when you interrupt someone in a conversation. Otherwise, everyone else could be liable and taken to prison. Violations of free speech are when powerful institutions render very strong punishments for those who dare to speak out, as which was done to us. So anyways, he gets up and he says, hey, Michael Oren, propagating murder is not an expression of free speech. And our side of the audience just thundered with applause. And then typically what was typical of these type of protests, because it had happened to us as well, is that students would just be escorted out if they were disrupted. And usually they didn't have anything tasteful to say like we did.
And there had been protests like these, like against like Cheney and Olmert. I think like Ehud Olmert. There was one,
exactly.
And it was a normal like back and forth. But the protest was registered, and you're escorted out, and in that sense, and never criminally charged. Yeah.
But there were never really like consequences for racist protesters, for Zionist protesters, for pro-genocide protesters. And so we sort of, and again, our form of protest was relatively tame. We didn't say any obscenities. We didn't physically get in people's faces or anything. We just spoke truth to power. And what ended up happening was, again, in this sort of climate in which it is taboo to recognize the humanity of Palestinians, in a climate in which U.S. commitment to Israeli genocide is ironclad, and Israel is the main facilitator of ethnic cleansing in Palestine, and it cannot be, it's taboo. It cannot be questioned. At this time, the administrators felt so much power and authority over us that they would get up on stage and routinely like threaten us as if we were the guilty party, as if somehow being opposed to ethnic cleansing was a crime itself, and instead of celebrating it. And so they would get up, say things like, okay, get out of your system, but get out of our way. Hey, we have we're trying to listen to this apartheid apologist here, and you're getting in our way. And more of us, so there was 10 of us who got up and spoke at different times. There was one of us who was leading a chant as he was exiting at the end of the event, but that was one by one. We got up at different intervals and spoke a little bit of our truth to power.
What do you remember about the arrest and the escalation that followed? And how did it feel to go from a student action to facing a courtroom and a jury for crimes? I mean, uh, was there a sense of dehumanization in how you were treated by authorities and the media during that period?
Absolutely. Glad you mentioned it. So it's funny, when I was arrested, I got up and I said, at my point, I sort of ad-libbed this part, and this part is still very relevant today. At a time when the accusation of genocide was not a part of popular discourse, I said, "You, sir, are an accomplice to genocide." And then I
Hmm.
repeated that under the Fourth Geneva Convention, Israel has a responsibility as an
Yeah.
occupying power to ensure the welfare of the people it occupies.
This was said to Michael Oren, right?
This is what I said to Michael Oren. And I
Yeah.
remember being terrified. Imagine being surrounded by hundreds of
Yeah.
angry, hateful, conservative white people who really, are pretty much expressing just by being there, hey, we're super okay with your entire family getting wiped out and your village being paved over so we can have a whites only settlement. Yeah, so I was terrified, but I remember it was like kind of like if you've ever done cliff diving, your body is telling you, gravity is not our friend, don't do it. But you kind of have to force yourself through sheer willpower to do
Yeah.
it. And I felt that I would be betraying my sense of morals and justice if I cowered from this moment. So I got
Yeah.
up and I said what I said. I was immediately apprehended by 4 police officers, very roughly. And they would normally, again, just escort people outside. No, we were taken. I was handcuffed before I even got to the door. They handcuffed us, and when we came in, we saw a bunch of police batons, riot gear. These people were prepared to use violent force against us because this was such a pompous, bougie event, not for our sake or the recognition of our humanity, but just for the sake of, their, whatever, racist self narcissism, whatever. They don't want to like, make things awkward or unpleasant for the other audience members. And I remember some of us were even assaulted by the audience with impunity. The police didn't do anything towards those people. And we were detained in the bowels of like the university, like this weird back room, and
Mm.
we were kept there until for hours. And I remember that it was a logistical issue, not a moral issue or ethical issue or even legal issue, that they wanted to take us to jail, but they didn't have enough cop cars for us, so they decided to reluctantly release us that evening.
How did it feel like to go from a student action to facing a courtroom and a jury? But how were you treated by the authorities and media
Oh, that's right.
specifically?
So
And
media was a funny story. So again, with going back to this racial criminalization of brown men, and showing us as like savages that are existential threats to white civilization, is funny because media outlets that were neutral, like SNBC or CNN, we briefly made national headlines, even probably for a briefer moment, some international attention. But on these things, they often focused on my better dressed counterparts. Asatrina. Some of us had wore glasses and button up shirts and looked sort of professional. And I noticed that the media outlets that were antagonistic towards us, like Fox News, fixated on my image. There was this camera angle that made me look like a giant relative to the 4 police officers that apprehended me. And this tan skinned man sort of bellowing at this auditorium, this pompous kind of like upscale auditorium event. And it was almost as if Fox News was communicating like they were trying to stoke the fires of white indignation. They were trying to say that like, are you really going to allow this Mediterranean gorilla to wreak havoc on your college campus? And so, yeah, that's how media treated us, very dehumanizingly and kind of as like this brute, this savage that needed to be dealt with authorities, that there has to be consequences for people like this. So that was how media treated us, and that was how the authorities treated us. And the university itself, even though we acted as individuals, decided to forcefully disband SJP, MSU for an entire year and forced the entirety of that organization, a certain number of people were forced to do 50 hours of community service. And they love community service.
Yeah.
Community service is a part of our Muslim and spiritual tradition. But the idea that we had to apologize for speaking up against racism and injustice through community service was an offensive plan. And then, of course, there's the criminal charges where it almost never happened before. The district attorney, who normally focuses on crimes of homicide, assault, and things of much graver and more serious need, instead fixated on us, 11 students who, again, were well within the norm. We did a pretty tame protest. We were very polite. No obscenities were issued. We cooperated with police officers. Legally, I think you're allowed to just drop limp and have police officers drag you, but we cooperated with everyone.
Yeah.
And as a result, we faced criminal charges, and he was demanding up to a year in jail. And he used a law. This was a case of discrimination through selective enforcement, that every state has weird laws. I think there's some state out there where you're not allowed to give beer to a moose. You can't chew gum while walking on the sidewalk or something like that. There's weird laws out there. But the idea of selective enforcement is that powerful institutions and people can selectively enforce those policies against people whose politics don't align with theirs, or to punish marginalized groups, or to send a chilling message that
can I clarify, like, what were you exactly charged under?
So there was a law in California that has only been used twice in the past century. We believe it to be technically in violation of the First Amendment of freedom of speech, but essentially, I think it was disrupting a meeting of public electors. That if you disrupt a meeting, any public meeting with anything,
Oh, wow.
You could potentially be charged. Now, this is such a ridiculous. Now, what I'm saying is there are strange laws that exist that may not be constitutional, but because they're seldom used, it doesn't become relevant. So they exist, but they're never really used. And you have to, and if you're charged with one of these laws, you can't challenge its constitutionality in that case. You have to wait till after the case is over, and then in a separate attempt, challenge the constitutionality of that law. So it was disrupting a public meeting and conspiracy to disrupt a public meeting, which is, again, a violation of free speech, a very evident one. But again, it has seldom been used, and so it's never been really relevant until, this guy almost exhausted the statute of limitations for a misdemeanor, something that never happens.
Wow.
So clearly, this was a person. Tony Rakakis was a district attorney. He's not appointed to his position. He's elected into office, and he was trying to score some cheap political points with racist voters by really disproportionately punishing us students. And honestly, it felt very violating. It made you feel very vulnerable. And it didn't deter us in what we did, but it just made you feel sad that you live in a world where speaking out against the murder of children.
What was the impact on you guys, the whole case? Did it impact how you could get work or those sort of things? Was there any material impact in that sense in how you were treated?
Honestly, despite their best attempts, our community has amazingly gotten behind us, and in a way of saying, you'd think that sometimes vulnerable communities fold in the face of intimidation or fold in attempts to intimidate them. But our community stood strong and united behind us. And I think there has been, honestly, no real negative impacts for us in terms of, we could have, in terms of years later seeking employment and everything. We have, I think, among the Irvine 11, we have, I don't know how many, I want to say 4 or 5 physicians, somebody with their master's in business, a PhD, someone who's in management for nonprofits. We're all doing great. And we want to make that clear, that any story telling you that you will suffer if you speak out against Palestine